Thanks so much to Thrive Market for sponsoring this video. So Mr. Collins loves Lady Catherine. She is his noble patroness. He's so eternally thankful. But why? Like, what is the relationship of Mr. Collins and Lady Catherine? Why is he so obsessed with her? How is she his patroness? Isn't he a clergyman? Doesn't he work at a church? What is happening here? Those are great questions, and we're going to answer them for you here today into a basic introduction of clergymen in Jane Austen's novels, where we're going to explain how the clergy worked, how they got their jobs, how there were patronesses, and much more. If you want to learn all about that, then definitely stay tuned for today's video. My name is Ellie Dashwood, and this is my channel where we talk about history and literature. If you like either of those things, please subscribe. So one of the key aspects of understanding clergymen in Jane Austen's era is to understand how religion worked. Many people are familiar with the Church of England today or the Anglican Church. It still exists, but back in the day, if you lived in England, you were Anglican. Unless you weren't, but the vast majority of people were in fact Anglican. There was a Catholic population that society was highly prejudiced against. Also, there was a Jewish population that faced a lot of anti-Semitism. And two, there was a growing base of dissenting churches. So these would be smaller Christian churches that just didn't agree with the Church of England. They had different ideas about what the scriptures say. And we see Elizabeth Gaskell, the authoress of North and the South, belonged to the Unitarian Church. So she was of the dissenting faith, and we do see those religious questionings happening even with Margaret Hill's father in the novel North and South. Another interesting thing we saw growing in the Regency era was agnostic and atheistic thinking. Now, this was way before Charles Darwin published The Origin of Species. However, there was already a population that was leaning that way in the Regency era. And of course, even within the Anglican Church, there were different movements and people thinking, oh, the church should go this direction or should go this direction. There was a lot of religious debate in general at the time, even within the same church. However, while there was a low level of religious diversity in English society at the time, more or less, the Anglican Church dominated everything and had all of the tithes from everybody. Because, my friends, it does not matter if you are a Catholic or you are Jewish or you're an atheist. You're required by law to give 10% to the Anglican Church and keep the Anglican clergy living well or living poorly. We'll get more into that later, but it doesn't matter what religion you are, you're paying tithes to the Church of England. Now, of course, when it comes to Jane Austen, the clergy, she understood them incredibly well. She was, of course, the daughter of a clergyman, the sister of clergymen, the cousin of clergymen, the friend of clergymen. She lived quite the clergy life. Now, what's fascinating about the way Jane Austen handles the clergy in her novels is she often disassociates them from a lot of religious context. So, for example, even though she was deeply religious herself, you never see her characters going on about God, the Bible, or Jesus in any of her novels. Rather, the clergy is a secular position of importance, of money, of a lifestyle, and it's treated in that secular way throughout her books. But before we dive into the clergyman lifestyle, here's a word from this video's sponsor. So years ago when I went gluten-free, one of the first things I did was sign up for Thrive Market. So I'm so incredibly excited that they're sponsoring today's video. So Thrive Market is a great place to shop for healthy and sustainable groceries for your entire family. And one of my favorite things about them is that they have filters on their website for different dietary needs. So whether you are vegan or if you are like me and need everything to be gluten-free, you can just click on their filters and it's so awesome. I can find new and exciting gluten-free foods to try. So here is what I'm trying out this order. I got some zucchini hash browns, sweet potato puffs, my favorite gluten-free bagels, and the thing I'm most excited to try, which is pepperoni pizza snacks that are gluten-free. Can you believe it, guys? I have not had a pizza snack since going gluten-free. I'm so excited. I also got some steak because I am obsessed with making Korean barbecue ever since I went to Korea. And I love that Thrive Market has a great mixture of food like steak and so many pantry essentials and snacks. One of my favorite things they have are sweet potato chips. They're so yummy. So if you're looking for an easy way to shop for healthy groceries online, then definitely check out Thrive Market. Just click the link in the description below or go to thrivemarket/Ellie Dashwood to get 30% off your first order and a gift worth up to $60 when you sign up for Thrive Market today. Now, back to the video. I feel like one of the most religious of her books is in fact Mansfield Park, but even when we see Edmund Bertram's future job being talked about, yeah, he needs to be there for his parishioners and know what's going on in their life and be of good service to everybody and give his sermons every Sunday, but you never see them going into like these deep what is the real purpose of spirituality and is the church true and these are my thoughts on God. Like you never see that, and I think if you compare and contrast that with Anne Radcliffe's The Mysteries of Udolpho, where again, the heroine is at a convent, she's praying, there are these deep spiritual things happening, mysteries of life, where Jane Austen very specifically leaves that all out. Now, she tends to focus on 3 different types of clergymen in her books, which are curates, vicars, and rectors, and so that's what we'll be covering here today. Of course, there were other higher levels of clergymen, like deans and archbishops, but they're not in her books, and they're not going to be in this video. I know, all of the archbishops are just so sad they didn't make it in this video, but they should have made it in her books, and then they would have. See, they were not thinking ahead. They should have befriended Jane Austen and got their way into her books, but alas. So, clergyman lifestyle. Let's start with, what was their social status? I know you guys are always curious about this question. The answer is, clergyman was one of the very few occupations that a gentleman could have and still be considered a gentleman. Of course, one of the major marks of being a gentleman was not working. However, they had to carve out these little niches that were exceptions to that because the younger sons needed some sort of job. Right. For example, in Mansfield Park, Edmund Bertram needs some way to make money. He's the younger son of a baronet. He needs to be a gentleman still. They don't want to degrade the guy to actually having to go into trade or something. So he can go into the clergy and be a clergyman, but still a gentleman. So this means that the clergy was not only a great job or opportunity for younger sons, but for other members of the extended family, right? If you remember the gentry, your younger son might be going into the clergy, and your second cousin, and your third cousin, and your second cousin once removed is also a clergyman, because they all come from money, but at the same time, they're not the branch of the family that inherited the money, and so they need to find some other genteel thing to do. Now, another group of people who really wanted their sons to become clergymen, or potentially even become clergymen themselves, is middle-class social climbers. Of course, I have an entire video on social climbing in the Regency era, and this was one of the few gentlemanly occupations you could put your family into that could help you climb generationally up that ladder. Of course, this worked best for the middle class if they had the money to educate their sons and then get him a position after he was ordained. However, there were some that didn't even have the money or the connections that were still able to make this transition, and it was one of the back doors into a higher social class was getting into the clergy. Now, of course, you might be like, why is money and who you know so important when it comes to becoming a clergyman? Couldn't you just get hired at a church? No, you could not. And now, guys, we are going into the very important steps on how to become a clergyman. So let us imagine that we're one of those younger sons, like Edmund Bertram or Henry Tilney, that is destined for the church. How do we make our family's aspirations come true? Well, the first thing we would need to do is get an education. Now, the most basic level of education required was the same for any gentleman of the time period, and that would be to take a degree from Oxford or Cambridge. Those were pretty much the only 2 universities in the country at the time, and they were hotbeds for socializing and making important acquaintances and not really studying that much, but what you are studying is a lot of classics and rhetoric and that sort of thing. So most of Jane Austen's clergymen go to Oxford, as did her father and brothers, so she might be a little Oxford biased here, but you know who went to Cambridge? George Wickham. When Mr. Darcy's giving the Wickham backstory, this is what he says. My father supported him at school and afterwards at Cambridge. Most important assistance, as his own father, always poor from the extravagance of his wife, would have been unable to give him a gentleman's education. Now, of course, we know Mr. Darcy Sr. did this to prepare Wickham for a job in the church. And after a young man graduated with a bachelor's degree from Oxford or Cambridge, he was ready to be ordained. Or was he? Did he need to go through additional training, some sort of seminary, something other than studying classics and rhetoric? The answer is no. No, he did not. But he did actually need one more thing before he could get ordained, which is turn 24. Have you ever wondered why Edmund Bertram in Mansfield Park is just hanging out at his parents' house? Right? Like, he's already graduated from Oxford. He's supposed to become a clergyman. Why hasn't he done it yet? The answer is he's just waiting to turn 24. Say you've graduated from Oxford or Cambridge, you're 24 years old. What do you do next? Well, you need to get a letter of character from preferably someone at your university saying that you are a great and wonderful guy and that everyone should totally want you as a clergyman. And then you take that letter and you go to see a bishop. At this point, the actual process of getting ordained was incredibly easy. In fact, Irene Collins, in the classic study of Jane Austen and the Clergy, describes the process this way. The bishop or his representative was supposed to satisfy himself that the candidate was competent in Latin, sufficiently versed in scripture, and acquainted with the liturgy and the 39 articles. Some assumed that a candidate equipped with a university testimonial required no further scrutiny. Ben Lefroy, ordained by the Bishop of Oxford in 1817, was merely quizzed about his connections with George Austen, whom his lordship remembered. And so really getting ordained was a pretty simple process. In Sense and Sensibility, we see Eleanor expecting that Edward Ferrars can be ordained in a couple of months. He might want to brush up on some of his Latin that he's forgotten since school, but again, that might not even come into question in this thing. But after the bishop is like, yeah, you're an okay guy, I will make you a priest. What do you need to do next? You need to have a parish. Because in order to make money as a clergyman and have this as your actual career, what you need is to be appointed as the priest of a specific parish because you earn your income from the tithes of that parish. And so on, unless you get a parish, you don't get money. And guys, getting a parish was not that easy. Welcome to a quick guide to how the Georgians viewed church parishes. Basically, if you were appointed as the priest of a parish in this time period, you got to collect all of the tithes of that parish, and that would be your income or your living. Now, we see that term living used a lot in Jane Austen novels. We see the Delaford living goes to Edward in Sense and Sensibility. The Hunsford living goes to Mr. Collins in Pride and Prejudice. And Mr. Wickham was to have the best living in Mr. Darcy's gift once it fell vacant. Basically, when the priest who already is earning that income dies, Mr. Wickham gets to move in and start earning that money. Now, of course, this raises the eternal question of why does Mr. Darcy have the power to give out church livings to begin with? Right? Or Mr. Collins had his living from Lady Catherine. What does Lady Catherine have to do with church livings? Why are they letting the rich people decide who gets to be the priest in the area? That, my friends, is because rich people back in the day owned something called advowsons. So if we want to understand the patronage advowson system, we need to rewind a little bit in history and imagine we are the Darcy family. We're super rich. We own a lot of land and we have a lot of tenant farmers. However, those tenant farmers, you know what they need? They need religion. And guys, there's a shocking lack of churches on our estates. Right? We have all these tenant farmers that need to go to church on Sunday, but no churches. You know what we're going to do? We're going to build churches for all of these guys on land we own with our own resources. Because again, all these poor people need to go to church. So as the Darcy family, you build a bunch of churches across your estates. But you know what the church says? They're like, wow, that was great. Thanks so much for building all these churches. As a perk for doing that, we're going to let you pick who gets to be the priests at these churches forever. So even when you fast forward to the Regency era, that Mr. Darcy still gets to pick who serves as the priests at these churches because his family built them way back in the day. Now, this was an actual legal right called an advowson. Now, advowsons were considered actual property attached to the manor. So, for example, Mr. Darcy still owns Pemberley Manor, and that manor has attached to it advowsons to be able to pick the priests of the churches of that manor. And so, because he owns that, he has that right. Now, of course, in Pride and Prejudice, we have that moment where Mr. Bingley's like, if Darcy would only sell me Pemberley. Well, if Darcy did sell Mr. Bingley Pemberley, Mr. Bingley would now have those advowsons and be able to pick the priest because he owns the manor. But again, I don't see Mr. Darcy really doing that. Now, for example, if Mr. Darcy picks someone to be a priest at one of his advowsons, that is called a presentation because he has to present that person to a bishop for approval. So a bishop was required to approve a person's pick. However, that was kind of formality. People just was like, this is the guy. And the bishop was like, okay, you're the guy. Good job. Go be a priest at that parish. Have fun with that. So the landed gentry and nobility did have a huge amount of power when it came to church positions and this ability to present people to these livings. However, there were other ways to become a parish priest as well. Some advowsons were owned by the church itself. Perhaps it's attached to a cathedral, or also universities or other institutions like that owned some advowsons that you could possibly get at. But in Jane Austen's novels, these private advowsons are one of the number one things we see her using with her characters. And even if the rights to presentation to a parish were owned by the church, for example, that didn't mean they were easier to get. If anything, it meant you had better be BFFs or the son of a bishop. But basically, that is how the patronage system worked in Jane Austen's time. Basically, someone who owns this advowson can appoint someone to be the priest and get them stamped with the mark of approval by a bishop, and now they can earn that income off of tithes. But how do you find a patron? Right? Like, that's great. You've just been an ordained priest. You're like, I need a parish now. How do you get one? The answer, my friend, is who you know. So during this time period, there were about 3,000 families in England that had the power of patronage, but they were not all created equal. Some were much, much more powerful patrons than others based on two basic aspects. One, some families held more than one advowson, meaning that they had more than one living in their gift. This is, for example, with Mr. Darcy. Mr. Wickham was supposed to get the best living in his gift, meaning that he does in fact have other ones. The second big factor is how much are these livings actually worth, because all livings were not created equal. For example, in Mansfield Park, Sir Thomas Bertram is a very powerful patron because not only does he have more than one living, but they're actually worth quite a bit. The one right by Mansfield is worth almost 1,000 a year, and the one at Thornton Lacey that Edmund actually takes over is about 700. Meanwhile, the one Colonel Brandon gifts to Edward Ferrars in Sense and Sensibility is worth only 200 a year, and many parishes were sadly worth even less. So all of this explains why Mr. Collins is so obsessed with Lady Catherine, because she is a very powerful patroness. First, she obviously presented him to the living at Hunsford, which is a very valuable living. He makes a good income off of it. But that is not all that Mr. Collins wants from her. It's more than likely that she actually has more than one living in her gift. And Mr. Collins is like, if I'm really nice to her, when the guy in her other living dies, she'll give that living to me. Because technically a priest could hold more than one living and collect the tithes from more than one parish, which would be a huge boost to their income. And this is what Elizabeth figures out when she goes to visit Mr. Collins and Charlotte. The book says, very few days passed in which Mr. Collins did not walk to Rosings, and not many in which his wife did not think it necessary to go likewise, until Elizabeth recollected that there might be other family livings to be disposed of. She could not understand the sacrifice of so many hours. Lizzie's like, I see what you're doing, Charlotte. You're trying to get that other living. You know who else is very keyed into Mr. Collins' game? Mr. Bennet. Towards the end of the book, when it comes out that Darcy's going to be marrying Lizzie and Lady Catherine's all upset about it, he writes this to Mr. Collins. But if I were you, I would stand by the nephew. He has more to give. He's pointing out that even though Lady Catherine is a powerful patroness with multiple valuable livings in her gift, you know who has more? Mr. Darcy. At the same time, though, do I ever imagine Mr. Darcy wanting to appoint Mr. Collins to any of his parishes? No. Could you really imagine that? Mr. Darcy would need a complete personality makeover to make that happen. Now, this concept of pluralism or a priest holding more than one parish caused quite a bit of debate during the time period because it was like, what are you going to do? Do both sermons on the same Sunday? Do one alternating? What if the parish is far away? Like, are you going to travel? Are you going to just completely neglect your people? And the solution they came up with were curates. Basically, these were guys who were priests, who were not officially appointed to any parish, but you could hire them to do your parish duties and pay them an agreed upon salary as opposed to them getting the tithes from that parish. Now, curates were notoriously underpaid, and it really lacked that stability of being like, hey, this is my real parish. I get to stay here forever, because pretty much the priest who hired you to do his duties could always fire you, replace you with his son when he grows up, die, and then have a new priest come in. Basically, nobody wanted to be a curate forever. It might be a nice little starting position if you can't find anything better, but basically, it was not a good long-term deal. And that's exactly what we see happening in Persuasion, where Henrietta wants her boyfriend to be able to become a curate for this elderly parson who she thinks should just retire and give her boyfriend a shot. Now, of course, it was incredibly common for patrons to use their power to help out their family members, their friends, their acquaintances, the people who really kiss up to them in the case of Lady Catherine. But something else they would sometimes do is sell this power. Now, this is a practice we actually see discussed between Eleanor and her brother in Sense and Sensibility, after her brother is shocked to hear that Colonel Brandon just went and gave Edward a living for free. He says, "Really? Well, this is very astonishing. No relationship, no connection between them, and now that livings fetch such a price." What was the value of this? About $200 a year. Very well, and for the next presentation to a living of that value, supposing the late incumbent to have been old and sickly and likely to vacate it soon, he might have got, I dare say, £1,400? And how came he not to have settled that matter before this person's death? Now, indeed, it would be too late to sell it, but a man of Colonel Brandon's sense, I wonder he should be so improvident in a point of such common, such natural concern. Well, I am convinced that there is a vast deal of inconsistency in almost every human character, I suppose. However, on recollection, that the case may probably be this. Edward is only to hold the living till the person to whom the colonel really sold the presentation is old enough to take it. Aye, that is the fact. Depend upon it. So what John Dashwood is saying here is that Colonel Brandon, before the current parish priest even died, should have been lining up the next candidate. He should have been like, hey, who wants to pay me so that when this guy dies, I will appoint you and then you can earn the tithes off of this living. Now, of course, if the person paid $1,400, as long as they lived longer than 7 years at $200 a year, they would then start earning off of this investment. Now, of course, men would buy presentations to parishes for themselves, or they would also do it for their sons. So that's what John Dashwood means when he's saying that Edward's holding it for whoever really bought it. Because if, say, there's a father out there who looks at his 11-year-old and is like, you're going to need a job when you grow up. That's gentlemanly. I'm going to buy this living for you. And when you're 24, you can take it over. And Edward would just be the placeholder until this kid turns 24. However, of course, that is not what's actually happening. That is just what John Dashwood would do to make the most money off of it. Now, this is, of course, exactly what we see happening in Mansfield Park, where Sir Thomas has to sell the next presentation to the Mansfield Living in order to raise some funds. But, of course, it's only that one presentation. After Dr. Grant, who he sold it to that time, dies, he can now appoint his son to the Mansfield Living, as he does. Which would be, of course, a huge added income for Fanny and Edmund after they're married. Let's talk a little bit about income. Now, a clergyman's income has several different factors that contributed to it, but the most obvious and biggest one was obviously tithes. Now, this is an important difference here between rectors and vicars. So, these are actually two different positions. So someone who is a rector, like for example, Mr. Collins, gets all of the tithes on everything, whether it's wood or hay or apricots or eggs. People are out there giving him 10%. However, vicars only get small tithes as opposed to great tithes. Great tithes are hay, wood, and corn, because someone else is in fact getting those tithes because of like history, and someone else got awarded the right to it. And while it might not sound like a major thing that you don't get a tithe on corn, if you live in an area where they grow a lot of corn, that is a huge percentage of your income that you don't get. So being a rector was much preferable to being a vicar. You know who is a vicar though? Mr. Elton and Emma. And that, my friends, is why he has to marry rich. He's not getting all of the tithes. Now, the clergy literally had to go settle accounts with their parishioners themselves. They would go to a farmer and be like, okay, you got like 10 acres of corn. About 10% of 10 acres of corn is worth this much. So that's how much I'll be expecting this year. And so really, how much a parish was worth fluctuated both with market prices, but also with how strict a priest was, right? Like if he was really out there demanding 10% of everything all the time, he would make a lot more money as compared to a priest who's more kind of lackadaisical about it. Now, of course, a clergyman got to live in a parsonage house, which could be great or terrible. But if you're like Henry Tilney, who's the son coming into the parsonage house of the patron, they'd probably go renovate it for you, upgrade it for you, because they want it to be nice. Now, usually around the parsonage house, you would have something called the glebe, or fields that go with the parsonage that you can farm on, that you can have animals on. Each parsonage has a different size glebe, but they're not all the same. They're not all as productive, but some people could make some good extra cash off of farming on the little parsonage land. And of course, there were fees for services like baptisms and marriages. You could make some extra money. I wonder if parsons were ever out there like, hey, I'm going to set this couple up and then I can make money off of their wedding. Okay, the fees were not that high. They probably wouldn't go to that lengths for that amount of money, but like imagine if they did. And that was like their extra source of income, was arranging marriages so they could perform them. Of course, a clergyman's income would also definitely benefit from having private investments, a private personal income, marrying wealthy. That's one of the reasons Henry Tilney's father is like, you need to marry money. You're only a clergyman. Get some extra cash going in. And that, my friends, is how they actually got the living out of the living. They had to collect tithes from people and marry money if possible, and try to get Lady Catherine to give them additional livings. And then hire a curate to do the duties of that living and pay him not the best. She has more in her gift, but not as much as Mr. Darcy. Let me know in the comments down below. What do you think of the clergy in Austen's era? Would you want to be part of it? If you were a young lady and you had to pick between a clergyman and a sailor, who would you marry? Let me know in the comments down below. And also definitely remember to check out this video's sponsor. Remember to check out the special offer from Thrive Market for you guys, which is 30% off your first order and a gift worth up to $60 when you sign up for Thrive Market today. As always, guys, keep being awesome because you're awesome. Bye!